In the New York City, where towering buildings reflect the glow of a million lights, lived a man who seemed to have it all. Alexander Kane, a self-made millionaire, known for his sharp mind and relentless drive, had built an empire from the ground up. His name was synonymous with success, power, and wealth. Every room he walked into, people turned their heads, eager to catch his attention. He had the luxury cars, the sprawling mansion, and a lifestyle most could only dream of. From the outside, it appeared he had achieved everything anyone could ever want. But beneath the surface of this glamorous life, Alexander carried a weight that no amount of money could ease. Years ago, during a difficult period in his life, his then-girlfriend, now wife Sarah, had become pregnant unexpectedly. At the time, he was not the man he is today. He was just starting out, filled with ambition, but unsure of what the future held. Both Alexander and Sarah had agreed that having a child at that moment would derail their plans. After long, tearful discussions, Sarah made the decision to have an abortion. It was a decision that haunted Alexander for years, leaving him with a hollow ache in his chest every time he thought about what could have been. He never talked about it, not to anyone. The pain was buried deep inside, hidden beneath his polished exterior. For years, he told himself that it was the right choice, that they were too young, too unprepared. But there were nights when he lay awake, haunted by the thought of the child that never was. The idea of a lost life, a part of him and Sarah that never had the chance to exist, gnawed at him in the quiet moments. We would be really thankful if you can like and subscribe right now. WW would really appreciate that. Yet life moved forward. Alexander became wealthy beyond imagination. Sarah stood by his side as they built their dream life together. But that old wound never truly healed. Even as they settled into a life of luxury, something was always missing, a child to fill their home with laughter. They never spoke about the abortion again, almost as if it had been erased from their lives. But the emptiness lingered. And then one day, a chance encounter shattered everything Alexander thought he knew. It was an ordinary afternoon when he happened to pass by a homeless shelter on his way to a business meeting. He rarely gave much thought to the people he saw on the streets, their lives so distant from his own. But this time, something caught his eye. A young woman, barely in her 20s, with strikingly familiar features. There was something about her eyes, her face, that tugged at his memory. He couldn't shake the feeling. He walked away, but the image of her lingered in his mind, a gnawing sense of recognition that he couldn't explain. Days passed, but he found himself returning to that moment again and again. Then one night, as he was going through some old papers, he stumbled upon a long, forgotten envelope, Sarah's medical records from all those years ago. His hands trembled as he opened it, expecting to find the cold, hard truth he had buried for so long. But what he found inside made his world come crashing down. There was no record of an abortion. Sarah had never gone through with it. His heart raced, and the weight of betrayal hit him like a freight train. The child, his child, was out there, somewhere, alive. And suddenly, everything he had believed about his life, his marriage, his choices, was thrown into chaos. In that moment, Alexander Kane, the powerful, composed millionaire, felt more lost than ever before. Let me tell you the backstory of this relationship first, as it will help you understand better. Years before Alexander Kane became the millionaire known for his wealth and power, he was just another ambitious young man trying to make a name for himself. Back then, his life was far from the polished luxury he would one day enjoy. He was hungry for success, working late nights and sacrificing sleep to get his startup off the ground. During those struggling years, he met Sarah, a bright, kind-hearted woman with dreams of her own. She was studying to be a lawyer, equally focused on building a career. They clicked instantly, bonded by their shared ambition and the belief that together they could conquer anything. Their relationship was passionate, fueled by the excitement of youth and the belief that the future was theirs to shape. They spent countless nights talking about their dreams, their plans for the future. But amidst their hopes and aspirations, there was little room for distractions, and starting a family was never part of their immediate plan. For Sarah, her career was just beginning, and Alexander was focused on expanding his business. They were two people in love, but committed to making something of themselves before settling down. Then came the news that changed everything. Sarah was pregnant. It wasn't something they had planned, and certainly not something they had expected at that point in their lives. The news hit them like a tidal wave. For Alexander, it felt like his world was closing in. He was still struggling to build his company, working endless hours and barely scraping by. A baby was the last thing he felt prepared for. Sarah, too, was overwhelmed. Her law school ambitions were still on the horizon, and a baby seemed like an impossible roadblock to everything they had worked for. They were young, scared, and unsure. The weight of responsibility loomed large, and both of them feared it would derail the dreams they had so carefully built together. After days of long, emotional conversations, they made the decision that seemed the most practical at the time. Sarah would have an abortion. It wasn't an easy choice, but they convinced themselves it was the right one. They cried together, mourned the future they would never have, but ultimately they chose to move forward with their careers. It was a decision they both agreed on, or so Alexander thought. In the weeks that followed, Sarah became withdrawn. She was quieter, more distant, but Alexander assumed it was just the weight of the decision taking its toll on both of them. They never talked about it again. They both buried the pain deep down, focusing instead on the future they were determined to create together. Eventually, Alexander's business took off, and Sarah went on to become a successful lawyer. It seemed like their plan had worked, and they were well on their way to the life they had dreamed of. But what Alexander didn't know was that Sarah had made a different choice, one she never told him about. On the day of her scheduled abortion, Sarah sat alone in the clinic's waiting room, her heart heavy with doubt. She had convinced herself this was the right thing to do for both of them, but as the minutes ticked by, an overwhelming sense of guilt and fear washed over her. She couldn't go through with it. The idea of ending her pregnancy felt like something she would regret forever. In a moment of quiet rebellion, Sarah got up from her seat and left the clinic. She didn't have a plan, only the certainty that she wasn't ready to let go of the life growing inside her. The weight of her secret decision bore down on her immediately, but she couldn't bring herself to tell Alexander. She didn't want to lose him. She feared that if he knew she had kept the baby, he would see it as a betrayal, an obstacle to their future. So she made a choice. She would carry the pregnancy to term in secret and place the baby up for adoption. She told no one, not even her closest friends. It was a burden she carried alone. As the months passed, Sarah hid her growing belly beneath loose clothes and carefully timed excuses. She told Alexander she needed some time away to focus on her law studies, spending several months abroad under the pretense of an internship. When the baby was born, she made the heart-wrenching decision to give her daughter up for adoption, hoping that this child would have a better life than she could provide at that time. She told herself it was the only way. When she returned, her body had changed, but Alexander was too busy to notice. Life quickly resumed its hectic pace, and Sarah managed to hide the truth from him. For years, they lived their lives as if that chapter had never existed. She buried her guilt, just as Alexander had buried his pain. But deep down, Sarah knew the lie was festering, waiting for the day it would finally come to light. As time went on, Alexander's company flourished, and their life together seemed perfect on the surface. But the secret Sarah carried never truly left her. Every time she saw a child, every time they passed by a playground or heard the laughter of young families, her heart ached with the memory of the daughter she had given away. And as Alexander's success grew, so did her fear that one day the truth would come crashing down and destroy everything they had built. That day was fast approaching. The lie she had told to protect them was about to tear them apart. Now we will talk about daughter's life. While Alexander Kane was building his empire and living a life of wealth, power, and luxury, his daughter Emily was living a life he could never imagine. Unbeknownst to him, the little girl who should have grown up in the safety and comfort of a home filled with love and warmth was left to navigate the harsh realities of the world alone. Emily's life was the complete opposite of the privileged world her father inhabited. From the day she was born, Emily was abandoned into a system that offered her little chance for happiness. The adoption Sarah had so carefully arranged didn't go as planned. Emily bounced from one foster home to another, never truly finding a family that could care for her the way a child deserved. Each move was a new heartbreak, a new loss, and every time she left a home, the hope she would ever belong anywhere grew fainter. She quickly learned that love, stability, and security were luxuries far beyond her reach. By the time Emily was a teenager, the instability of her life had taken its toll. She dropped out of school at 15, having fallen too far behind to ever catch up. Her foster families had done little to support her education, and her teachers didn't have the time or resources to help a girl who was constantly moving from place to place. With no diploma, no skills, and no family to turn to, she found herself on the streets, just another forgotten soul in a city that barely noticed her. Life on the streets was brutal. Emily often went days without a proper meal, relying on the kindness of strangers or the occasional meal from a shelter. Most nights, she slept in alleys or under bridges, the concrete her only bed. The bitter cold winters and scorching summer days were unforgiving, and with no one to care for her, she grew used to the constant hunger, exhaustion, and the feeling of being invisible. She was a face in the crowd, just another person struggling to survive while the world moved on without her. Every day was a battle for survival. She had no family to call, no friends to lean on, and certainly no place to call home. The streets became her constant companion, but they offered no comfort. The only thing she had was her will to keep going, though even that was tested on the darkest days. She watched other homeless people give up, fall into addiction, or disappear into the system, but Emily fought. She refused to let herself be swallowed whole, even when it seemed like there was nothing left to fight for. Still, despite her strength, there were moments when she felt like she couldn't go on. The loneliness, the hunger, the cold, it all became too much sometimes. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, wondering why she had been dealt such a cruel hand in life. Why didn't she deserve a family? Why didn't anyone care about her? She had no idea who her parents were or why she had been abandoned, but the question haunted her constantly. It felt like there was a hole inside her heart that could never be filled. As the years passed, Emily grew older, but her life didn't improve. She worked odd jobs when she could, but without an education, opportunities were few and far between. She would pick up shifts washing dishes in rundown diners or cleaning motels for a few dollars here and there. It was never enough to get her off the streets for good, though. The cycle of poverty seemed impossible to break, and with no one to guide her, she felt trapped. Despite the hardships, Emily never gave up completely. She had moments of hope, fleeting as they were, where she dreamed of something better. She would pass by the grand buildings downtown, looking up at the offices and imagining what it would be like to work there, to wear nice clothes, to have a stable job, and a place to live. She often found herself staring at the wealthy people walking by, wondering what their lives must be like. She couldn't imagine having so much, living without worry, without fear of where the next meal would come from. It was during one of these aimless walks through the city that Emily crossed paths with Alexander Kane, though neither of them knew the significance of the moment. She was sitting on a park bench, her hair tangled, her clothes worn and faded. She watched as the world passed by, as it always did. And then Alexander appeared. He was rushing to a business meeting, his mind on a million things, dressed in an expensive suit, exuding the confidence and power that came with his position. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Emily looked up, and something about him caught her attention. There was a familiarity in his face, though she couldn't place why. His sharp features, his intense gaze, it was like she had seen him before, but she had no idea where. Alexander, too, noticed something about her, but in the rush of his day, he didn't give it much thought. To him, she was just another homeless person in a city full of them. He had seen countless people like her before, and while he sometimes felt pity, his life rarely allowed him the luxury of stopping to think about it. But something about that moment stayed with both of them. For Emily, it was a strange sense of recognition, like she had come across someone important, though she had no idea why. For Alexander, it was a fleeting sense of curiosity. Why had she looked at him like that? He quickly brushed it off, thinking he would never see her again. But life has a way of bringing people together when they least expect it. Neither of them knew it at the time, but their lives were about to collide in a way that would change everything. For Emily, that brief glance was the first step in a journey that would finally answer the questions she had been asking her entire life. And for Alexander, it was the beginning of a revelation that would shatter the carefully constructed world he had built. After the fleeting encounter with the homeless girl in the park, Alexander Kane couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her face, her eyes, there was something about her that lingered in his mind. It was an odd feeling, one he couldn't explain, but every time he tried to focus on his work, the image of that girl sitting on the bench flashed in his mind. At first, he brushed it off as nothing more than a moment of pity. After all, he was a man of action, used to making decisions and moving forward. But this time, his thoughts kept circling back to her. Days passed, but the unease remained. Alexander found himself thinking about her at odd times, during meetings, while driving, even at home in the middle of dinner. It didn't make sense. Why would a random homeless girl haunt him like this? Then one night, as he lay in bed, the puzzle pieces started to come together. He remembered her eyes, those eyes that seemed so familiar, yet so distant. They looked like someone he knew. He couldn't put his finger on it at first, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. And then it hit him. Her eyes, they were just like Sarah's. The realization jolted him upright in bed. His heart raced as he tried to dismiss the thought, but it was too late. The resemblance was too uncanny to ignore. Could it be? Could that girl be his daughter? No, it was impossible. He had been told Sarah had the abortion years ago. But now doubts started creeping in, and Alexander found himself questioning everything he had believed for so long. Unable to shake the thought, Alexander started digging for answers. He had never asked for the details back then. The pain of the decision had been too much, and once Sarah had said it was done, he had never questioned it. But now those old wounds were opening again, and Alexander needed to know the truth. He went through old records looking for anything that could confirm Sarah's story. Days of searching led him nowhere, but the growing sense of doubt only intensified. One evening, as he sat in his office, sorting through boxes of old paperwork, he came across a small envelope he hadn't seen in years. It was buried beneath stacks of old contracts and documents, nearly forgotten. His hands trembled as he opened it, and there, inside, were medical records from the time when Sarah was supposed to have had the abortion. His eyes scanned the papers, expecting to find closure, something that would put his doubts to rest once and for all. But what he found shattered him. There was no record of an abortion, no mention of a procedure, no confirmation from a doctor. Instead, there was a vague note indicating that Sarah had missed the appointment and had never rescheduled. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She had never gone through with it. His child, his daughter, was alive, and she had been out there all this time. The girl on the park bench, the one he had barely noticed, was his daughter. An overwhelming mix of emotions washed over him. Guilt, anger, disbelief, and a deep, aching sadness. How could this have happened? How could Sarah have lied to him all these years? And what kind of father was he to not have known, to have lived his life in luxury while his daughter grew up homeless and alone? The guilt was unbearable, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had failed her. He had failed them both. The anger came next, fierce, burning anger directed at Sarah. How could she have kept this from him? How could she have let him believe their child was gone, when in reality she had been out there, suffering, struggling to survive on the streets? He thought of all the years that had passed, all the opportunities he had missed to be a father to her. He had been living in blissful ignorance, while his daughter, had lived a life of hardship he could never imagine. He couldn't wait any longer. The truth had to come out. Without thinking, Alexander stormed into the house, his heart pounding with a mixture of fury and desperation. Sarah was in the living room, reading, completely unaware of the emotional hurricane that was about to hit. Alexander stood there for a moment, staring at her, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. How could she sit there so calmly after everything she had done? "Sarah," he finally said, his voice barely steady. She looked up, sensing the tension in his tone. "We need to talk. Now." Sarah put her book down, her face quickly shifting from confusion to concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, standing up to meet him. "I found the records," Alexander said, his voice tight with emotion. "I found out the truth. You never had the abortion, did you?" Sarah's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face for a split second before she tried to regain her composure. But it was too late. Alexander had seen it. The truth was out. She didn't deny it. Instead, she lowered her head, her hands trembling as she spoke. I, I couldn't do it, Sarah admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I was scared. I thought it was the right thing for both of us. But when I got to the clinic, I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't end our baby's life. Alexander felt a wave of emotions crashing over him, relief that the child he thought he had lost was alive, but also overwhelming anger at the years of deception. Why didn't you tell me? He demanded, his voice shaking with rage. Why did you let me believe she was gone? Why did you hide her from me? Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, her voice trembling, as she struggled to explain. I was scared, Alex. I thought if I told you, you'd leave me. We were so young, so focused on our careers. I didn't want to ruin everything we had worked for. I didn't want you to resent me for keeping the baby. Alexander shook his head, his mind reeling. So you just gave her away? Without telling me? Without even giving me a chance to be her father? Sarah's tears flowed freely now, her guilt and shame laid bare. I thought I was doing what was best for her, she sobbed. I thought she would have a better life with someone else. I never imagined she'd end up like this. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating them both. Alexander couldn't believe what he was hearing. His daughter, his flesh and blood, had been out there all these years, living a life of poverty and pain, while he had lived in comfort, completely unaware. The betrayal cut deep, but so did the guilt. He had failed her too, even if he didn't know it. I have to find her, Alexander said, his voice breaking. I have to fix this. I have to make it right. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Sarah sobbing behind him. His world had been turned upside down, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to stop until he found his daughter. Now let's talk about father-daughter connection. Alexander Kane had spent the past few days consumed by one thought: finding his daughter. Every moment that passed felt like an eternity, the guilt gnawing at him relentlessly. He had failed her once, but he wouldn't fail her again. The search wasn't easy. Finding someone with no known address and no clear connections was like looking for a needle in a haystack. But Alexander was determined. He used every resource at his disposal, reaching out to private investigators, local shelters, and anyone who could help him track down the girl he now knew was his daughter. Emily stared at him, her face a mixture of disbelief and anger. She stood up quickly, stepping back as if the distance between them could somehow protect her. "You're my father?" she repeated, her voice rising with each word. "Where were you all this time, huh? Where were you when I was hungry? When I was sleeping on the streets? Where were you when I needed someone?" Her words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He had expected this reaction, but nothing could have prepared him for the raw pain in her voice. "I didn't know," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I thought your mother had an abortion. She told me." "She lied," Emily cut him off, her eyes blazing with anger. "She lied and you just believed her? You never looked for me, never even thought to check. You just went on with your life while I was out here, alone?" Alexander felt tears welling up in his eyes. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. She was too angry, too hurt. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "If I had known, I would have been there. I would have done everything to find you." Emily turned away, her shoulders shaking with emotion. She had spent years wondering about her parents, wondering why they had abandoned her, why they hadn't come for her. And now here he was, this man who claimed to be her father, standing in front of her with apologies and excuses. It was too much to process. She didn't know whether to scream at him or cry. Part of her wanted to hate him, to push him away and never see him again. But another part, a small, quiet part of her, longed for the father she had never had. For a long time there was silence. Alexander stood there waiting, hoping she would give him a chance. "Emily," he said softly, "I know I can't make up for all the years we lost. I know I can't take away the pain you've been through. But I want to try. I want to be part of your life if you'll let me. Please." Give me a chance. Emily didn't turn around, but she listened. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, the desperation of a man who had just realized how much he had lost. But could she trust him? After everything she had been through, how could she trust anyone, let alone the man who hadn't been there when she needed him most? I don't know if I can, Emily finally said, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can trust you. Alexander's heart sank, but he wasn't ready to give up. I know it's hard to believe me, he said gently. I know you have every reason to hate me, but I want to prove to you that I'm not going to leave you again. I want to help you, to give you the life you deserve. Emily finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. You think you can just show up and fix everything? She asked, her voice breaking. You think money is going to make this all better? I don't need your charity. I'm not offering charity, Alexander said, his voice firm but kind. I'm offering a chance for us to get to know each other, for me to be the father I should have been from the start. Emily wiped her eyes, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, hurt, and confusion. She didn't know what to think, what to feel. Part of her wanted to run, to keep him at arm's length and never let him in. But another part, a small, vulnerable part, wanted to believe him. She had spent her whole life feeling unwanted, unloved. Was it so wrong to want to believe that someone, somewhere cared about her? I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know if I can do this. Alexander stepped closer, but kept his distance, respecting her space. I'm not asking you to decide right now, he said softly. I know this is a lot to take in, but I'm not going anywhere, Emily. I'm going to be here, waiting, whenever you're ready. We can take this one step at a time. Emily looked at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was a man who was hurting, just like she was. She didn't know if she could trust him, but for the first time in her life, someone was offering her a chance at something better. I'll think about it, she finally said, her voice hesitant. Alexander nodded, relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That's all I'm asking, he said quietly. Just think about it. As he turned to leave, Emily watched him go, her heart torn between anger and hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Time for unpacking wife's motive. Sarah sat alone in the quiet of their home, her mind spinning with the weight of everything that had happened. She had known this day would come, had feared it for years, but now that the truth was out, the guilt felt unbearable. She had kept her secret for so long, convincing herself it was for the best, for both of them. But seeing the pain in Alexander's eyes when he found out the truth, she wondered how she had ever thought this could end any other way. It had started years ago, when they were young and scared, both trying to build their futures. When Sarah found out she was pregnant, the fear of losing everything they had worked for was overwhelming. She loved Alexander deeply, but she knew him well enough to understand that a child wasn't part of his plan back then. He was focused on his career, his ambitions, and she didn't want to stand in the way of that. They had agreed after tearful conversations that the abortion was the best choice for both of them. But when the day came, sitting in the clinic, Sarah couldn't go through with it. The fear, the doubt, it all overwhelmed her. She couldn't bear the thought of ending a life, especially not the life of the child she shared with Alexander. So she made a decision in that moment. She left the clinic without telling him and resolved to handle things on her own. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. She thought she could keep the baby, place her up for adoption, and spare Alexander the burden of raising a child when they weren't ready. But as the pregnancy progressed, Sarah realized that keeping it a secret was harder than she had imagined. Every day, the weight of her decision bore down on her, and yet she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. She was terrified of what he might say, afraid that he would leave her or resent her for going against their plan. So she kept the secret, bearing it deeper as the months went by. When Emily was born, Sarah made the heartbreaking decision to give her up for adoption, believing that it was the best chance for her daughter to have a good life. Even after the adoption, Sarah carried the guilt of her choices, but she convinced herself that she had done the right thing. She had protected Alexander from the chaos of an unwanted child, from a life he didn't ask for, and she had given Emily a chance at a better life. At least that's what she told herself. But as the years passed, the burden of that secret grew heavier. Every time she saw a child, every time Alexander talked about how they hadn't started a family yet, the lie twisted inside her. She had hoped that by keeping the truth buried, they could move forward, but deep down, she knew it would catch up to them eventually. Now, sitting alone in the quiet of their home, Sarah felt the weight of her actions crushing down on her. She had kept the secret for so long that she had convinced herself it was for the best. But now, with Alexander's discovery and the truth out in the open, she couldn't hide from the consequences anymore. She had hurt the man she loved, had taken away the chance for him to know his daughter, and now she had to live with the fallout. For Alexander, the emotional conflict was unbearable. He loved Sarah. He always had. They had built a life together, weathered storms, and supported each other through everything. But this was a betrayal he hadn't seen coming. How could she have kept something so important from him for all these years? How could she have lied to him about their own child, leaving him to believe that she was gone, when in fact she had been out there, living a life of hardship? He couldn't understand it. The anger surged inside him every time he thought about the years they had lost, the moments he had missed. His daughter had grown up without a father because of Sarah's decision, and that hurt more than he could put into words. But at the same time, there was a deep sadness beneath the anger. He knew Sarah wasn't a malicious person. He knew she had made her choices out of fear, out of a misguided attempt to protect him. But that didn't make it easier to forgive. Alexander found himself torn between his love for Sarah and the betrayal he felt. He wanted to scream at her, to make her feel the pain he was feeling, but he also knew that wouldn't fix anything. What was done was done. The years they had lost couldn't be undone, and there was no way to change the past. But the future? That was still in their hands. He could choose to walk away, to let the anger consume him, or he could choose to stay and try to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But forgiveness wasn't easy. Every time he looked at Sarah, the woman he had loved for so long, he saw the lie. He saw the years of deception, the choice she made without him, and it hurt. But at the same time, he saw the woman who had been by his side through everything. The woman who had made a terrible mistake but wasn't beyond redemption. He knew that forgiveness wasn't something that would come quickly. It would take time. Time to heal, time to rebuild, time to figure out if they could ever be the same again. As Alexander sat in their living room that night, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words, he knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for now he needed to find a way to move forward. For Emily, for Sarah, and for himself. Alexander Kane knew that words alone wouldn't heal the wounds of the past. He couldn't erase the years his daughter had spent struggling, the nights she had gone hungry, or the pain of feeling abandoned. But he was determined to show her that he was here now, and that he wasn't going anywhere. This wasn't about quick fixes or grand gestures. He wanted to prove, day by day, that he was ready to be the father she had always deserved. His first step was small but meaningful. He arranged for Emily to have a safe, comfortable place to stay. No more shelters, no more nights on the streets. It was just the beginning, but he knew it was a start. He didn't push her to accept more than she was ready for, didn't try to overwhelm her with material things. Instead, he focused on being present, showing up, and offering her the one thing she had never had from him: stability. But even as he tried to mend the broken pieces of their relationship, the tension between them remained. Emily couldn't simply forget the years of pain, the feeling of being unwanted. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. Every conversation, every interaction between them was tinged with the unspoken question: could they truly move forward? Despite the challenges, there were moments of hope. A smile here, a shared laugh there. Small cracks in the wall Emily had built around herself. She didn't trust easily, but for the first time in her life, she wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a father who cared about her. As they sat together one afternoon, the silence was comfortable, no longer strained. They weren't there yet, not completely, but for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten. And perhaps with time and patience, they could find a way to rebuild, one step at a time. As Alexander looked back on everything he had gained in life, he realized that none of his wealth or success could fill the emptiness of not having his daughter by his side. The years they lost, the pain they both endured, weighed heavily on him. He had spent his life chasing success, but now he understood that family was the only treasure that truly mattered. But the question remained, would Emily ever fully forgive him? Could they truly rebuild what had been broken? Only time would tell. Their journey was far from over, and the future held the answers no one could predict. Make sure to like and subscribe for more interesting stories like these.